I'm Andy Bates, part of the team here at KFUO. While you hear me on the air and in podcasts, I'm also part of the team that works behind the scenes to bring you the programs like this that you value. What you hear on the air and in podcasts is just the tip of the iceberg. Listeners like you generously support everything that makes radio and podcasts happen. Administration, cutting-edge technology, software, hosts, producers, and more. You make this happen. Can we count on you to continue this support? KFUO Share-a-thon, now through April 5th, is a great time to show your support and make a gift or make a plan to give for a whole year. Your generosity is important and appreciated, not just by the KFUO team, but by listeners who get to hear and enjoy Christ-centered programs every day. Will you make a gift today? kfuo.org/give. kfuo.org/give.
Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God, His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and ascended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on KFUO, Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I'm your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. Sharper Iron is underwritten by Lutheran Church Extension Fund. Together in Faith, LCEF helps to start, sustain, and strengthen LCMS ministries through financial and strategic partnerships. Visit lcef.org for more information. On this Tuesday, March 18th, we're studying 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1 to 12. In today's text, David goes to live among the Philistines in hopes of ensuring that King Saul will no longer seek after him to kill him. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us Pastor Dan Torkelson. Pastor Torkelson serves at Mount Olive Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin. Pastor Torkelson, welcome to Sharper Iron.
Thank you. Great to be here. Good to be here with you. This is the first time for us.
Yeah, so. It's fantastic to have you as a first-time guest. We're looking forward to studying 1 Samuel together today. We're in chapter 27. Remind us of the context of this book, where we've been, helping us to lead up to this chapter.
Right. Well, with regard to the entire book of 1 Samuel, it seems to me that the book is actually best understood as the record of the earliest kings of Israel. It is not necessarily intended to be the story of Samuel, and Samuel dies fairly early in it as well. But the pitfalls and the pratfalls of the early kingship are really featured extensively all the way to the end of 1 Samuel, with especially the life of Saul. But David is introduced here, and as we get into chapter 27, what we have David on the run. He's a fugitive because the overall situation in Israel is that you have one king, but you have two anointeds, and that's an important detail to keep in mind in these last chapters of 1 Samuel, because the only one who really respects that fact is David himself. In the last two of the last three chapters before chapter 27, David has opportunities to put Saul to death. In fact, he has golden opportunities to put Saul to death, and he refuses to do so. He doesn't follow the advice of even his own warriors with him who wants him to do it. I'm sure David politically understood that he probably creates a civil war if he does that, but in his rationale, when he does talk to Saul, he has conversations with Saul both times. He is the one who keeps remembering, and actually with his soldiers too, that Saul is still the Lord's anointed, which is why he's not going to put him to death. I think it was in 26, he says, in chapter 26, he says to his people, who knows what will happen with Saul. Saul may eventually just die on his own, and then the kingship, will eventually become ours. And as it turns out, civil war is, something that he's not able to avoid. It's going to happen anyway because of the odd nature of the fact that the kingship's not continuing through Saul's line. It really won't even be able to by the time Saul's dead, but still, claims to the kingship are going to look strange, I think, to Saul's supporters anyway. But so what we get here in coming into chapter 27 is that Saul has twice been spared by David and has twice made promises that he's not going to keep chasing David. This is David's fugitive years. And so twice he's made that promise, and you get to the start of 27, and David is of the realization that Saul just cannot be trusted to keep those promises. If he remains in Israel, and this is really, I always find verse 1 of 27 a little tragic in a sense. He's not safe in his own country because Saul keeps tracking him down. So 27 begins with the realization that Saul is going to remain after him. Saul is going to try to kill him, and thus it'd be better for him to get out of Dodge.
Right. Yeah, so that's one of the questions I suppose I had looking at chapter 27, which we'll read here in a moment. But since just thinking about it as its place in the entire narrative, you have Saul who has said to David, I'm not going to kill you. Like, they've gone their separate ways. There's this truce. We know how it went the first time. It seems that David has that realization. But just looking at David's actions here to flee to the land of the Philistines, which this is also not the first time that he's tried this, I guess so far in David's story, most of the things that he's done seem to have been the right thing. There was a touch-and-go moment with Nabal where he almost took blood guilt, and he was spared from that by the wise voice of Abigail. But this is another one of those moments in David's story where I'm starting to wonder, is this really the right thing that he should have done? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on his flight to the land of the Philistines in that regard.
That's a good question. Without teasing I guess the rest of the chapter, it proves to be, but that's not without a lot of work on David's part to make it happen. He has to offer a lot, I think, to make this work out. It seems like a less than ideal decision to have to make, and I sense when I read the rest of the chapter that David's well aware of that. David knows that going off into Philistia is gonna mean going off into the enemy of Israel, for one thing. And in truth, it's really not any safer, I think, than being in Israel unless he's able to make lemonade from the lemons he's been handed here. Sure. So I think the challenge in the early part of 27 is that it's one thing, quite a sad thing, that David cannot stay in Israel and be safe. That's a sad thing. But we all know, and I suppose by application to our own lives as Christians, we all know that the world outside the church too is obviously more dangerous. So David understands that he's courting danger, I think, by doing this, but he's already demonstrated a lot of political savvy, a lot of wisdom. He's counting on the Lord protecting him. He is the other anointed. And because he is the other anointed, I think in this section, he shows a tremendous amount of trust. Okay. That somewhere between God's protection of him and his own faculties and his own smarts, he'll be able to work this out in the end. I think the whole behavior in 27 sure is forward-looking in some ways. This is temporary. I think he's well aware of that, and the only one who doesn't seem to know that is Achish, the king of Philistia at the time, the king of Gath. So,
sure. Okay. I think that's helpful. I think it's helpful. Maybe similar to the way, if you think about, go all the way back to Genesis, to Abraham, when there's the famine and he ends up going to Egypt, right? There are times where the people of God leave the spot where they probably should be for a time for these, I think, wise reasons. David's probably doing something similar here.
Right. Okay. Exactly. I don't want to tease the text because we haven't heard
it. All right.
Yet.
Yeah, we should read it. Okay, let's read it. So, 1 Samuel 27, we'll just read the whole chapter. It's pretty short. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maach, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household. And David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land, and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah," or "Against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites," or "Against the Negev of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, "He has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel, therefore he shall always be my servant." And that is the text for today, 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1 to 12.
I'm glad you read that.
Some of those place names are a challenge, to be sure.
That's right.
So, David, we've already started to talk about this, but take us a little more deeply into his words at the opening of this chapter, his reasoning, his thinking behind leaving Israel, fleeing to the Philistines, what he expects this will do with the situation with Saul.
Right. He's certain that Saul will not keep his promise from chapter 26. And that's the second time Saul's made that promise, and he went back on it the first time. The language of "there's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines" strikes me as a recognition that it's his best option probably amongst a number of not good options. He's not saying it'll be good for me necessarily to go there. There's a way that language hits me as he's contemplated his options, that's the best one he's got. The rationale becomes the main reason is so that Saul will knock it off, so that Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand, which proves to be correct right away. David's instincts are good. Why would Saul not continue? Well, if Saul knows he's in Stia or in the land of the Philistines, Saul's not going to want to pick a fight necessarily with them. There's no need for an unnecessary war. I mean, they were always fighting with the Philistines in one way or another, but there was no need to escalate it. So knowing what he knew about Saul wasn't always a lion-hearted king. He figured in the land of the Philistines, Saul would leave him alone. Saul would not chase after him, which is ultimately proven to be true. David and his men wind up with King Achish at Gath, and the Lutheran Study Bible is kind of fun in this. It talks about the almost humanitarian crisis that might have created in Gath. It's a living accommodations nightmare for them in Gath, that David and all of his men are going to be living right under the king's nose like that. At the same time, I think early on that establishes a certain kind of transparency that he has to have toward Achish, however that's pronounced.
Yeah.
So Achish can see that David's not there to undermine him or anything like that. It's reminiscent in many ways. Actually, I think this whole section of David's life, the fugitive section, is I should say reminiscent. For us, it's reminiscent, but here it's a foreshadowing, for instance, of what it must have been like, for instance, for the Israelites in exile. In the letter to the exiles in Jeremiah 29, they are instructed, pray for the peace of the city, work for the good of the city. And it would appear that's what David's intent is. And it seems to me that everything David does later in the chapter probably does have some benefit for Philistia, even if it's not the benefit Achish thinks it is. Yeah, we'll get to that when we get to it.
Yeah,
but
let's pull on that thread a little bit. The theme of exile, or as we've maybe started to talk about previously, God's protection for his people in a foreign land or in a different place than you'd expect them to be. I think the exile is a good example of it, although in the exile, you have also the Lord's wrath as a part of the reason for the exile to happen, which is a little bit different than here. Maybe another place we could think about is looking forward from this point, but for us reminiscent, of when the Lord Jesus flees to Egypt as a little boy to escape the wrath of King Herod. Maybe there's a foreshadowing there, especially knowing that Jesus is the son of David.
Yeah, I think if we want to go before this, you can even look at Abraham moving from Haran to Canaan. He has to live in a strange land, a very hostile land in some ways. It's challenging to think that he was already probably 90 when all this took place. He's wealthy, he's been settled, and it would wind up taking, obviously, a lot of faith to do what he had to do. And he didn't do that out of God's wrath, but he had heard God's promise and he was trusting in that. The exile was, as you mentioned, a matter of God's wrath. But yeah, Jesus going to Egypt was escaping not God's wrath. That's God's protection, just like it was for David, just like it was for the Israelites who came to Egypt initially a couple generations after, 3 generations after Abraham. It just simply underscores that we Christians often find ourselves in a situation where we live in a world that we know is not entirely safe for us. Right. And unfortunately, I think for David, the place where he should be safe, he's not. When he comes back and becomes king, I don't know that he's ever truly safe then either, in Israel. But at this time, at least, he's got a certain amount of safety. He has protection, and it does disincentivize Saul in the end. I've been contemplating with regard to this text just the challenge of what we as a church try to do for people, what we try to provide for people, what communion of saints really means. That hopefully inside our doors, the world is safely on the outside, and that is really probably not what David's experiencing. Obviously, he has God's protection in the land of the Philistines, but I don't think he's entirely safe there. In fact, if the wrong thing happens, he's less safe than he probably would be in Israel. But God uses these exiles either to judge, like he did with Israel, or to protect, like he did with Jesus, or to challenge, like he did with Abraham, moving from Haran to Canaan. And ultimately, the challenge, I think, of 1 Samuel 27, because you see a pretty crafty David in this chapter, is still to recognize that God's overseeing all of this. In the middle of all this craftiness, in the middle of all this deliberation of, where is best for me right now, because he's still trusting. I think he states it quite well in the earlier chapters about he's pretty sure something's going to happen to Saul. Yeah. And that's actually coming quickly, as we know, have read 1 Samuel cover to cover. That's coming pretty quickly now. But for the time being, I just think that David must know this is going to be a temporary exile, and that this is his best of a lot of not great options, I don't think.
Yeah, I think it's good. We need to keep the overall theological context of all of the time of David's flight, such that we do recognize within this chapter the Lord's continued care for David, working through David's own shrewdness, as we'll talk more about in a little bit. But this is still the Lord at work to protect his people. And I think this theme of exile is a helpful one as we think about how this comes to us today. And there's a number of places that the scriptures speak of the church as being in exile. The one that came to my mind was Peter in his first epistle, writes his first epistle to the elect exiles of the dispersion. Mm-hmm. And you think about what the elect exiles go through in 1 Peter. There's suffering in 1 Peter, but the call to steadfastness and the call to remain faithful to the Lord. The other text that came to my mind in this regard with this idea of where is the church safe? Well, only with the Lord. It's in Revelation chapter 12, where you have the dragon who attacks the male child and, of course, is unable to devour the male child. And so then the dragon goes after the woman who gave birth. He goes after the church, and he's unable to harm her, but then he keeps going after the individual offspring, individual Christians. No matter where the church is, the dragon is always attacking. The devil is always attacking, but it's only with that male child, with the Lord Jesus, that we are safe wherever that physical location may happen to be.
Right. We have a citizenship in heaven.
Yeah.
That's our ultimate citizenship. So this life, for us beginning at baptism, but this life, living in this life prior to heaven, is fraught with dangers. There's that marvelous hymn in the hymnal, "I walk with danger all the way." And exile, without being able to guess too much at God's will, it seems like the whole purpose of exile is to teach his people to rely on him, to trust on him in the midst of the changes and chances of this life, and the dangers of this life as well. David is doing that. But I guess what I really like about this chapter in that context is the fact that God has given him a brain. And I sometimes I worry we portray trust as kind of a mindless activity that doesn't involve our brains. Think about, for instance, taking a call, which doesn't have it has a little bit of a connection, for instance, to the idea of exile. We serve in places we did not grow up, and we often find out as pastors when we get to our churches that they are still made up of sinners, and there are the variables that inevitably raise themselves when we take a call. And that hymn, "I Walk in Danger All the Way," has always struck me as very appropriate to the life of the pastor, not because of malice necessarily on the part of God's people. We have a teaching job to do too. There's a lot of things that maybe they don't understand or they can deepen their understanding of, and so we have to be patient and take our time with those things. And maybe that's a theme here too in 1 Samuel 27. He's refused to kill Saul when he had two golden opportunities to do so, because he's confident that something's going to happen with Saul, and he needs to let that happen on God's time. So there's no attempt on David's part to force the change of kingship. And I think that's really important. For us who live in exile too, everything still happens on God's time, and we have to be willing to wait. One of my favorite verses in the Old Testament, and this is David, Psalm 27, "Wait for the Lord." That's actually prefaced with that marvelous statement, "I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." And that statement is so elastic, because while that could mean, for instance, if I've got a person who's in the hospital who's going through a medical emergency, it could mean that they recover and they'll see the goodness of the Lord in this land of the living. But it could also mean that they will go to be with the Lord, where they are ultimately finally safe. I love that verse for that reason. But right after that, there is that marvelous instruction to wait. Wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart, and wait for the Lord. And so David is doing that. He's not twiddling his thumbs and just biding his time passively while all this happens, which is good too. We've got our vocations and our work to do. His vocation appears to be to take care of raiders or nomadic tribes that are going to be a problem for him in the future when he becomes king. But it is his vocation. It is what he has been given to do right now. And I guess what's really remarkable about it is that even though he knows he's in danger in Israel and he has to do this, I don't hear any complaining going on.
Sure.
I wonder about his men. How do his men feel about this?
That's right. Why are we going and living with those guys now? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. Psalm 27, the rest of the psalm also, in many of the verses, does speak about the enemies who are encamped against David and the way the Lord protects him. So, I appreciate that, bringing that one up. That's not one that has a specific superscription, but it has struck me throughout this section of 1 Samuel how many of other psalms have a superscription that mentions this particular time in David's life. It's like this it's remarkable how many of the psalms that have the specific superscription come from a time in which David wasn't safe from an earthly perspective. They were times of suffering, difficulty, and that's when he composed, I don't know if I should say his greatest psalms, but so many of them. It was precisely at a time of suffering and trial when he was crying out to the Lord, and the Lord delivered him.
Right. So, David wrote a full half of the book of Psalms, 75 Psalms, and that is it's an interesting thing I like to do. I study history, and I actually do subscribe to a methodological rule with regard to history that all history is biography in one way or another. It's good to get to know the lives of the people. And so when I'm reading Psalm 23, which does not have one of those superscriptions, or Psalm 27, which does not have one of those superscriptions, it can be a bit of a guessing game. So which David is this? Is this youthful David? Is this David the young soldier who's killing his tens of thousands. Is this David the fugitive? And interestingly, you can see, like Psalm 23 is actually a marvelous psalm to do this in, because you can see kind of all the elements. The shepherd analogy that goes back to his childhood, walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Well, that's his fugitive period here. And yet there is the table, the house of the Lord. There is a sort of kingly feel to it as well. And I'd like to do that, but what I've found over the years is that especially those psalms that do not have the superscription, that do not give us the context of the psalm, it's kind of fun to read them through every phase of his life. And Psalm 27 would be another good one in that regard, yes. But imagine the David who wrote, "I am confident that I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart, and wait for the Lord." Being the David of 1 Samuel 27, the one who is doing exactly that. That's pretty powerful. And at least with regard to its application to us, that's how we have to look at these things. Life may be going great for us, life may not be going great for us, but what is ultimately our reward in heaven, that's in God's hands. That's according to God's time. And we really don't do well to complain about it, or to wish it would happen faster or anything like that. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had a death in the congregation. I'm not in a congregation where I do a ton of funerals. We're not a small congregation, but we're a little bit more youthful here in Madison. But I did do a funeral, and I visited the man a few days before he died, and it was really during his kind of last strong moment. And I asked him how he was doing, and he says to me, "Well, I'm dying." And he said, plain as day, very, very content. He lived a long life. He seemed very content. He seemed totally resolved to that. I'm fine. I looked at him and was wondering, are you sure? Because he didn't look that way. But what I used that day was I did use Psalm 27 for him. That somewhere in here, even if it doesn't look like you're dying to me right now, I'm confident that you will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of living one way or another. And now we wait. And 3 days later, with his family and myself by his side, we didn't have to wait very long. We weren't even there an hour, and he passed very peacefully into his Lord's hands, and now he's truly safe. Now the exile of this life, which that's ultimately the theological impact of the theme of exile, is that life in this world, life in this fallen world since Adam and Eve's sin, is not always safe. It is dangerous. It's subject to death and decay. We live under the curse. We're going to hear that. Well, actually, this is going to air after that, but as we're taping this, we're going to hear that soon. And David. I guess as I've studied David over the years, and I just did a study on the life of David with our Bible study back in the fall, I just see everything good and everything hard about the Christian life. David is a man after God's own heart, still with a sinful nature, still capable of horrific things. And I take this chapter, which would be easy to kind of skip if you're reading 1 Samuel. Sure. It'd be easy to skip chapter 27. I take this chapter as good David, as the David who is willing to let God's time play out the way it's going to play out.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I really appreciate the putting Psalm 27 into this context, as well as to the other context of David's life, to the Christian's life, that we retain that hope and wait for the Lord whenever, wherever we are. We're going to keep looking at this chapter, 1 Samuel 27, more on the other side of the break. You're listening to Sharper Iron on KFUO. We're talking to Pastor Dan Torkelson this morning. We'll be right back. Please stick around.
Lutheran Church Extension Fund exists to support Lutheran Church Missouri Synod ministries and church workers. How do we do this? Your investment with LCEF makes it possible for LCMS churches, schools, organizations, and church workers to receive low-cost loans for new and growing ministries. And faithful Lutherans like you, church members and church workers alike, make that possible when you invest with LCEF. Learn more at lcef.org.
LCF is a nonprofit religious organization. Therefore, LCF investments are not FDIC-insured bank deposit accounts. This is not an offer to sell investments or solicitation to buy. LCF will offer and sell its securities only in states where authorized. The offer is made solely by LCF's offering circular. Investors should carefully read the offering circular, which more fully describes associated risks.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Tuesday, March 18th. We're studying 1 Samuel 27, verses 1 to 12, with Pastor Dan Torkelson. He serves at Mount Olive Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin. Pastor Torkelson, prior to the break, we have been talking about David's exile in the land of the Philistines, how the Lord continues to protect him there, how that applies to the Christian. Let's talk a little bit more now about his relationship with Achish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. It does strike me, he keeps going back to Gath, the place where Goliath is from. I don't know if he's still got Goliath's sword at this point. He had it earlier. He's taken it back to its homeland, but it's doing other things now. So talk a little bit about some of the interaction with Achish. You mentioned, he's got 600 men with him. How are they going to provide homes for all these people? That maybe is part of the reason why David says, well, let me go to one of the country towns. And he gets Ziklag, which stays with Israel. So talk a little about his opening relationship with the king of Gath.
Yeah, it seems to me that David, like I said at the outset of the study, David is aware that he's going to have to work to make this work. And so he spends time initially right under Achish's nose in Gath, creating probably, like it says in the Lutheran Study Bible, something of a housing crisis. In verse 5, David shifts gears and decides to, it seems to me like he's testing how good his relationship with Achish is right now. And I would argue it's good enough. I don't want to necessarily call it great, but it's certainly good enough. And he very respectfully, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. That gets his men out of Gath. He alleviates what could have been something of a housing crisis in Gath. Let us go somewhere else where we can live. And that leads Achish to actually give him what seems like a farm community called Ziklag. And in some of the details and some of the commentaries, it appears that these sorts of arrangements are understood as permanent, which is interesting because Ziklag will continue to belong to the kings of Judah. In verse 6, it says, to this day, or at least the day of the writing of 1 Samuel. So Achish gives him a town, gives him Ziklag. That's where they go. And he is there for about 1 year and 4 months, but the community remains part of Judah afterwards, especially after David returns, which is something again, David's got a long view here that Achish doesn't have. And the long view is, I don't plan to be here forever. Something will happen with Saul, or something else may call me back to have to go back to Israel. I don't know what that is, but for the time being, to him, it's all temporary. Achish, on the other hand, figures that if David visited him at Gath, things are not going well in Israel, and his idea of the long view is that David may never return, and that we don't learn that till the end of the chapter. But I think what happens now between here and the end of the chapter only confirms for Achish that that's how it must be. It must be that David won't be able to go back. I think at this point, Achish is willing to grant him these things. I don't think he's thinking as temporarily. You just don't get that sense. You get the sense that this guy's a fugitive and he got out of Dodge, and unless something seriously changes, he can't go back.
Sure.
So David...
If I can, just briefly, because we met Achish briefly in chapter 21, the first time David tried to flee. And at that time, the Philistines were maybe a little bit more aware of David's growing reputation. Maybe the memory of Goliath was a little more fresh for them at the time. Right. And David, I think, realized pretty quick he was in some danger there. So he had to pretend to be insane at that time. And Achish says, just get this guy out of here. This time, if we can maybe think about it from David's human wisdom, it seems that maybe the memory has faded a little bit in the land of the Philistines at this point. And so he maybe goes to Gath, builds a little bit of trust, just kind of lays low there. Now he feels like he's got a trusting enough of a relationship with Achish. So, all right, I'm going to ask for a place a little farther out, putting that distance between himself, thinking long view. And Achish has a sort of long view, but not the same one. And I suppose this goes to what we talked about on the other side of the break. Christians can wait for the Lord because we have the proper long view in mind. Like, we know where this is headed, and we know for a certainty, whereas the world may have plans and thoughts for the future in mind, but they don't really know what is coming next. And so even when they have some sort of long view in mind, they're still in the dark. Right.
The world doesn't have I think we're teasing the concept of hope here.
Yeah.
Hope for Christians is not wishful thinking either. David's patience and his willingness to wait is tied to the fact that he has a promise from God that he will be king one day. It's just like Abraham. Abraham's willingness to go to Canaan is tied to a willing, not a willingness, but an actual grasping onto the promises of God. That dictates what happens on Mount Moriah with the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac. That he's able to go ahead with that at all shows his absolute trust in the promises that God has made. David has promises too, and he's living exactly like his forebears. And hope, it seems to me, a Christian view of hope, a biblical view of hope, knows that there's light at the end of the tunnel and perhaps even can see it from a distance. We talk about heaven being the ultimate light. Obviously, we see that coming. It's not a wishful thinking. It's not, I hope I get this for Christmas, or I hope I get this for my birthday. It is a more certain thing. And what that does is that girds our loins as we have to be patient and work our way through the situations of life that are between us and that final realization of the hope, which is the face of Jesus at the end. By the way, Psalm 27, isn't that what David says there too? Your face, O Lord, do I seek? So when we think about David's long game, his being able to go back to Israel and become king one day is actually short range when you think about it. It's not just short range in the text, because it is short range in the text now. It's just short range in general. I think David even has, he has heaven and God's eternal kingdom in mind, and he behaves that way. I'm just astounded now. I even as we've been doing this, just going at this text and realizing that David just doesn't force anything. He moves things along at the right sort of pace here. He's had enough time to build trust with Achish, and then he goes to Achish respectfully. If this is the same Achish, and there's a debate if whether this is the next generation of Achish. Okay. Yeah, that's a debate. It's not a debate that anyone's salvation hangs on. But if it is the same Achish as the one who saw crazy David, it says a lot for how successful he was in getting that trust back. You're right. So I don't know. Maybe he's wearing
in the Lutheran Study Bible that maybe this isn't the same Achish. Okay.
Maybe he's wearing Goliath's sword and Achish just respects him for that.
It could be.
This is the guy who took out our champion,
Sure. Okay, so David has been biding his time, waiting on the Lord. The Lord continues to grant success, such that David now receives Ziklag as a place for him and his men, and that ends up being true up to the days of this text being written down. And so he's there for 1 year and 4 months. That's a significant amount of time, but he makes himself busy. And that's where we come to verse 8, and we start to hear about his raids against these various groups and how that gets played to Achish. There's a number of things to talk about. But one thing that did strike me is you were talking earlier about David having the long range in mind, knowing the Lord's promise. I think there's a bit of a contrast with Saul in this case. If you go back to when Saul was first anointed, it took a little while for Saul really to get going and to take that seriously in terms of starting to act like a king. David, on the other hand, he's been anointed, and it seems that he's starting to do the things that the anointed one of the Lord should be doing pretty quickly, including even now in the land of the Philistines. So with that in mind, kind of take us into what David starts to do from Ziklag.
Well, David and his men start making raids against these groups, the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. And the only one of those that I can recall ever running into prior to this was the Amalekites.
Yeah.
These are believed or known to be nomadic tribes. And that's hinted, that talks about how they cover a certain amount of land in their wanderings. And they are potential, Lutheran Study Bible says they are potential threats to the king of Israel, which is to say they are more, I think, a direct threat to David than they probably are to Achish. But David is you're right. This is prefiguring his kingship already, because he is using his men from the safe place of the land of the Philistines to start establishing to these nomadic tribes who the boss really is. And this, verse 9, I just noticed this in verse 9, and David would strike the land, these tribes have already been mentioned, and David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. And I don't know why the word sheep jumped off the page at me, except that if you put this into the context of how David was going to be different from Saul, you have to remember that God didn't just grant a kingdom to Israel to just give them what they wanted. God established his own version of a king. Basically, the deal when Saul became king was, look, I'll give you a king, but he's going to be my kind of king. And my kind of king, the template God uses to establish his form of a kingship, is that of a shepherd. And Saul, and you've covered this probably in previous episodes, Saul gets very, very confused because his kingship is both political and there are spiritual elements to it. And it's a lot of times in those spiritual elements that the major confusion arises. And he gets into big trouble with God over the slaughtering of the priests.
Well,
which
even
again,
just with the nature of, I didn't think about this until you brought it up, that he takes all these animals back with him. If you go back to where we first meet Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 9, he's having trouble finding his father's donkeys, which is a humorous thing. But even right. there, I think there's maybe a bit of a contrast between Saul and David. Saul, who doesn't end up finding the donkeys, they get found on their own by, the Lord works to do that. But here's David ably shepherding a variety of animals.
Right. And that's going to be, I just think it's a great nod back to his roots. He's good with this kind of thing. He defeats Goliath essentially because he was not afraid to take on the enemies that were always a threat to the sheep. He understood, and this is an important thing I think for kings to understand, is that when the threat is there, you don't no time to deliberate anymore. It's time to act. And what Israel is paralyzed out there when Goliath is there, and Saul can't figure out what we're going to do about this. Young David walks into that situation so decisively, and it does fit David's personality that while he's in this still waiting period, he, like I say, he's not twiddling his thumbs. He's getting busy with tribes, with peoples who are going to be threats to his kingship later. He's got the short, long view of my being king, and we talked a little bit just a few minutes ago about the longer, long view that he has too of the eternal sheepfold in heaven. But I just think verse 9 is this, it's kind of, it seems like just a details verse, but in David's life and in David's career, in his bio, this is significant that they're willing to take care of the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments. Now, some of that's probably tied to wealth and the accumulation of wealth as well. A lot of that stuff's going to eventually find its way to the new capital, which will be Jerusalem, I'm sure. At least the more material things. The animals may not live that long. But
one of the things you mentioned, the three tribes that are named, the Amalekites have figured a couple of times here in 1 Samuel already. Just a quick search, if I did it right, I didn't see the Girzites anywhere, but the Geshurites are mentioned briefly in a few places in the book of Deuteronomy, but the one that jumped out at me was in Joshua chapter 13, which is maybe a chapter that we don't know as well, but it's talking about the land that was still remained to be possessed. So Joshua 13, verse 2, this is the land that yet remains, all the regions of the Philistines and all those of the Geshurites. And they're mentioned a couple other times in that same chapter in regards to the land that's not yet been taken. I mentioned this to you ahead of our conversation here on the air right now. I was kind of wondering if perhaps part of David's work here is intended to like do those things that Israel had not done previously that they probably should have. And part of his work in the raids is like, almost like we're almost going back to the goal, if you can call it a golden age of, like, we just came into the promised land. It's almost like a renewal idea that here's a very significant figure by the fact that he's doing this.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's just one of the thoughts that I had. Yeah.
He's not the king, but he's in a sense behaving like it. I think what you're saying. And
he's doing things that Israel had left undone previously that was to their harm. You know, I mean, think about how they don't drive everybody out and how that really goes badly in the book of Judges. And now David is sort of, he's taking Israel back and bringing them back to a faithfulness that should have been there all the way back to the days of Joshua.
Sure. I'm totally with that. That's it seems like it's a bit of a political observation. If I were to take that up to a higher level, I think it just speaks to his decisiveness, which we see from the beginning of the story, but I think too his wisdom as well. Saul is the passive-aggressive king. David's going to be just the aggressive king, I guess. Sure. Taking care of Israel's problems as best as he can, while at the same time taking care of the sheep. You know.
Yeah, that's right. So now David is doing this from Ziklag, not quite under as watchful an eye from Achish, but he's still there in the land of Achish, and so David knows that, and in that wisdom, he doesn't leave the people alive thinking they might get back and tell Achish what I'm really doing. So David, on the one hand, he's got the refuge in the land of the Philistines, but he's not actually helping the Philistines like Achish thinks. So maybe talk about that. How did you, misrepresentation, I think was the word that you used to me earlier. Talk about David's misrepresentation of what he's doing here.
Right. Well, David's still accountable to Achish, and so Achish he probably would have had to send messengers or something like that and ask, well, where have you made a raid today? I don't know how close Ziklag is to Gath and how often they spoke face to face. But in his replies, the first one is remarkable. David would say, against the Negev of Judah. Well, that means inside Israel. Yeah. Well, I guess all of these sort of mean inside Israel, but it doesn't suggest he's going after the raiding parties. It suggests that he's making himself a bit of a nuisance to Saul, which would not have been a problem, I think, for Achish necessarily. And well, actually, Achish probably likes that idea in some ways, but that's not what David is really doing. So David is misreporting, he's misrepresenting his activities to suggest that he's taking on the real enemies of Gath, the real enemies of the land of the Philistines, when in reality he's taking care of the real enemies of Israel in a lot of ways. This misreporting is the challenge of this chapter. What is David up to? Can we justify that in any sort of way? And so I'm catching David here being shrewd, and this kind of leads us into some difficult sayings of Jesus, I guess, too, on this very subject. Be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But then the parable of the shrewd manager. I was looking at this and thinking of the parable of the shrewd manager in particular because the interpretative key, the interpretative key of that parable, is that Jesus is encouraging his disciples to use their brains, to use a certain sort of worldly wisdom or worldly knowledge to their advantage. He doesn't want his disciples to just get trucked by situations. If David was just sitting on his hands at this time, he probably wouldn't even be able to keep his men because they would decide he'd given up. So you have these moments in Scripture. I know when we talked before we came on, you mentioned a situation earlier here in even 1 Samuel where David is getting away with a bit of a deception. Actually, I think it is the playing crazy with Achish.
Sure, there's that. Jonathan and David together, tell a story to Saul to try to figure him out. David's wife, Michal, had told a lie to Saul. So there's been a couple of other times where there's been some deception going on.
Right, and God can act through all of that, too. I remember a number of years ago being struck by reading Luther's Genesis lectures, and he gets to the story of Jacob and Esau, and he raises that really critical question of, can God can God, because I think a lot of Christians want to think the answer to this is actually no. Can God still accomplish his good and gracious purposes through an act of deception like Jacob's toward Esau? Now that, I think, was much more malicious than this. Right. I think David is being shrewd. He's misreporting this to make it sound like everything is going to be great for you, Achish, but that's not what he's doing. And in these sorts of attacks, he should be being viewed, at least by Saul, if Saul's aware of that sort of attack, as still a big problem. And as such, that leads Achish to conclude, oh well, he'll never go back to Israel now that he's attacked these people who he really didn't attack. So I don't necessarily want to take this text as advocating for being untruthful with people. We want to be as transparent as possible. But again, if we put this into the context of what God is up to, David clearly gets some leeway for being shrewd here in how he handles Achish. Sure. If it's a foretaste of the feast to come when he becomes king, he's going to be a formidable king to negotiate against.
Absolutely.
He knows how to get what, I'd like to say to get what he wants, but I think it's probably better to say he knows how to get what he needs here. And hopefully he'll keep that distinction between needs and wants in mind when he's king so that he gets what Israel really needs. But he seems, to me, in this section, even though it's deceptive, he seems a lot smarter than Achish.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially I know we're stopping at 27, but as the book goes on, Achish is ready to bring David into battle with him against Israel, and it's only because Achish's men are like, hey, that's a really bad idea, that he ends up sending David back to Israel, and he receives that for which he has been waiting. But that takes us farther. But no, I think you're absolutely right that David here, well, you mentioned the parable of the shrewd manager in Luke 16. And in that parable, and this is probably maybe after the parable, Jesus says, the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. That's generally true. I think here David shows himself to be more shrewd. The son of light is more shrewd than the son of this world in the case of 1 Samuel chapter 27. And I do think, as you said, this isn't to say like just lie whatever, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. But there is I think a shrewdness that is very appropriate for the people of God. And I think David walks that line appropriately here. I think that's fair to say.
Right, and I think it's probably because, again, of what we've been talking about with the long view. Yeah. What do the sons of light have? You mentioned it before. What do the sons of light have that the world does not have? Well, we have the long view. A lot of corruption in the world today is the deployment of shrewdness for very, very short-range benefits and whatever. Another great rule of history and reading history is follow the money trail. When people are only in it for whatever cash or money they're going to get out of it, they're going to think very short range, and they might be very shrewd. They might be very good at getting all that money, but there's no long range plan with it. Especially once you die, it's not like we're going to pour all that money into your casket and bury you with it. What good is that? So there's a way in which that long view, that willingness to wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart, and wait for the Lord, means that in the face of these deceptive statements that David is saying to Achish, David knows where this is going, and he sees this as about the only way that we'll get there. Again, I don't think he's really forcing it. This still takes place over a kind of a significant amount of time, but the idea that Achish thinks he has an ally now, and if Achish has an ally, then Israel must have an enemy. This is shrewd. It's very, very shrewd. Achish is just along for the ride on this. David is taking him for a geopolitical lesson.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think a theological lesson too is that Achish thinks that he's got the upper hand, but really the Lord is at work through all of this to work the defeat of the Lord's enemies in very subversive ways. And I think that's another marvelous thing here that you see. Achish thinks he's got things made, he's in control, but really the Lord is at work through David, ultimately to bring about the defeat of the Philistines, which is, of course, long-range view, it is coming. This is where this is headed. We got about a minute here left, Pastor Torkelson. Help us to wrap things up. What do we do? How do we take this text, apply it as Christians? How does this point us toward Jesus and strengthen our faith in him?
Well, we walk in danger all the way, as I mentioned in the hymn before. That's important to bear in mind, that as long as we live in the exile of this life, we do need to keep the long view. We need to keep, and that long view is ultimately heaven itself. And I'm going to push it even further, because I went to St. Louis in the 90s, the resurrection, because we heard a ton of that when I was a student there, at least, the resurrection on the last day. Everything that happens today is small beans, good, bad, or otherwise, is small beans by comparison to the reward that awaits us. David has the earthly reward of the kingship lying ahead, but he's got eternal treasures waiting as well. And this is a marvelous roadmap for navigating the difficult circumstances in life patiently, hopefully waiting on him.
Pastor Dan Torkelson serves at Mount Olive Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin. He's been helping us today to study 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1 to 12. Pastor Torkelson, thanks for being our guest today.
Great. It was my privilege.
I'm your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. If you have any questions about this text, send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. It is always a joy to hear from you. Join us again tomorrow as we keep reading in 1 Samuel. We'll be in chapter 28. We go back to what happens in the land of Israel to King Saul, and he makes a very foolish move in where he seeks help. Thanks for spending the morning with us today. Talk with you again tomorrow.
Showing support for KFUO is now easier than ever. You can sport a KFUO shirt, swag, or even socks by visiting our online store. Go to kfuo.org/store and order high-quality KFUO-branded merch. You no longer need to wait for our annual share-a-thon for a chance to show your KFUO spirit. Visually share and wear this ministry out in the world by checking out our selection. Every purchase helps to support our proclamation of Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. Go to kfuo.org/store.